All right, so this video is just going to be a run through of doing a galaxy landscape and just kind of what I did in this one, some techniques that you could use to help you out if this is the style that you're going to go with. The techniques used in this video are wet on wet, rubbing alcohol in the sky while it's still wet, splatter, so white splatter for the stars in the sky, and dry brush for the pine trees. There's also a little bit of gradient wash, flat wash going on in the mountains. This video goes pretty fast. So here I'm just getting the paper wet so that I can apply that wet on wet. I don't want any of this paper to dry while I'm working because I want all of these to blend into each other. The best brush to use is like a really soft brush because it will leave less like markiness. I wanted something a little bit mottled, so I'm not using a super large brush for it. But you can see that I started out really light and then layered those colors darker. I didn't want to start out really dark, otherwise I thought I might have to pull from it. So I started off light and I'm going kind of to darker edges. So I mixed some colors into my lid from my palette. Oh, I'm going to pause it really quick. I mixed some colors in my lid from my palette and then also used directly from the palette in there. And every once in a while too, so let's just go back. Every once in a while I'm grabbing water directly from my water bins and adding it to it so that color will spread and become softer so that those edges aren't quite so harsh. So this is really wet on wet. I have to let this dry before I do my mountains in the front. So now what I just did and like what I'm doing right here is I'm taking a little bit of rubbing alcohol and putting it on a toothbrush. Toothbrushes are great for splatter effects. Because I want this to look a little bit kind of cloudy or mottled or really blended together, I used the rubbing alcohol while the paper was still really wet and splattered it on really sporadically. And what this does, it kind of creates more texture in the sky. It spreads the colors around a little bit. You don't see the same rubbing alcohol effect that you do when you're really specific about applying your rubbing alcohol. It's more even and creates more just kind of texture in the background. Then what I do is I take a little bit of white and I'm kind of like lightening up the galaxy portion in the middle, like the northern lights portion of it, and then I'm actually splattering that as well. So I'm just taking my brush and kind of tapping the paint off of the brush. Now here's where I should have let it completely dry before I started. I was trying to like rush my videos. You can use a hair dryer to help you dry as long as it's not super wet on wet that when you use the hair dryer it spreads the paint. But it does help to just like let an area dry before you're going to go up to the edge of it. You'll see that my mountains are a little bit blurry because they bleed up into that watery mixture above them. And after I peeled it off my table, set it aside, and did something else. You may have to do that. If you have a drawing board that you can actually tape yours onto, or like a piece of plywood or something, I just taped mine directly on my table, and then I just peeled the whole thing off with the tape and put it on my counter, and then did something else while I waited for it to dry. So right now, I'd actually let it dry and I went back in and redefined the edges of those mountains so that they weren't going to bleed into that background. Now again, atmospheric perspective, my back mountain is a little bit lighter in color. Here again, I had to let it dry. I wasn't about to add these little pine trees on top of wet mountains because then they would have really bled in. I redefined the mountains a little bit more too. So right now they're kind of a little bit of a flat wash. I did do a little bit of lifting while wet on the left mountain to get a little bit of texture in it. And not have it look so flat because it's closer. You should see a little bit more detail in it. But right now I'm using a dry brush technique, so my brush is not very wet. I'm applying a darker, thicker application. I wanted to redefine that mountain edge a little bit, so I applied a little bit of a more concentrated paint, but then I actually used water to pull it down, so it's a little bit more gradient. I was just like trying to blow on it to dry it. Now I'm doing, so I did my background first, my midground, and now I'm doing the foreground, the part that's closest. So like I'm looking through the trees into these mountains. So I'm adding some more pine trees in the front, again with like a dry brush. I didn't really like how they just looked like they were coming from nowhere, so I added like another little hill in the front as well. And again, that's darker because it's closer. The trees should be a little bit more in focus than the ones that are in the back, which are a little bit lighter. You can see I mixed up 3 different colors. So these are my back trees, these are my mid trees, and these are the trees closest to me. The ones in the back are also a little bit blue because atmospheric perspective will do that as well. So you can just see I'm kind of going through and fixing those guys up, going back and forth. I also do lift a little bit of color from the front with a tissue just because it gives it a little more texture. I added a little bit more white once the background was dry. I added some bigger stars, made one of my stars kind of like shoot out a little bit. And then again, remember when you're peeling away, peel away from your picture. And then here is the end result. So hopefully that helped you with some techniques.